Apple a Day with Dr. Amanda. I'm excited to have my colleague and friend Tameka Anderson with us, and I'll be introducing her in just a moment, but I'm so excited. So those of you if you're on YouTube, like, share, and subscribe. Always tell a friend. Today's lesson and really our talk is going to be on something that some people love to do and a lot of people find it challenging to do. So I am so delighted to have Tameka Anderson on our show today. And she is the founder of Parenting Confident Kids. So welcome, Tameka.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to talking about the hard conversations.
I'm excited. So what are some hard topics that you've had to address as a leader?
Oh my goodness. So racism, divorce, death, trauma, family dysfunction, lack of leadership, firing a client. I need to change as a mother. You name it, I've had it.
Okay. So those are quite a bit of some topics to have to talk about with other people. In terms of those topics, was there one, I know you mentioned many, but one that you find that people struggle with the most, or there may be a lot of conflicting conversations about?
So I would have to say out of all of them, the one that I see a lot of struggle with is racism.
And that's a big topic, and really even in the current climate, understanding what racism really is and how to have conversations with each other.
Yeah.
And so when looking at that, and maybe perhaps we'll be continuing to stay on that topic of racism, which is, currently and, has been a conversation and in our faces, right, in our lives daily. What was your hardest conversation you had to address with someone in the area of perhaps we'll do the racism?
So, okay. Well, as you know, I am African American. And so I had a conversation with someone who was non-African American. Mm-hmm. And obviously our views were slightly different. Mm-hmm. Slightly is probably an understatement. However, I digress. But it was difficult because I had to come from a place of not being defensive. At the same time, standing my ground, right? At the same time, not appearing to be a threat. So it was difficult doing the dance, if you will, of educating without being condescending, using empathy, and not being defensive. So yeah.
Yeah, and that, that's a really good point, looking at, how do we, have this conversation, and other people may view us, right, in a different light, even if we're speaking in a certain way, but their view might be like, ooh, it's condescending or this. And, you also, because you do have hard conversations, being aware of your own tone, right, like being aware of that, but also having feelings, right, which are normal. Well, what is normal, but, that come up because, of your experiences as well. So that is a really hard place to be.
Yeah.
And so when you do approach those conversations, I know you talked about it, like, how do you approach those hard conversations? Or like, say you find yourself in a moment where you're not really getting any headway, or everybody, there's really no listening to each other.
Well, the first thing that I always like to suggest is to approach it with empathy. Mm-hmm. Right? Because when you come from a place of empathy, that is like the highest form of knowledge, because now you're not condescending, you're not going to be defensive because you're not coming from an ego place. Mm-hmm. You're not coming from an I, or a need to be right. Mm-hmm. You're literally coming from a place of, well, let me put myself in that other person's shoes to try to see maybe where they are going in their thought process. And then it causes you to kind of like ask questions versus trying to be right. Because I think that's what a lot of people have and struggle with in conversations is the need to be right.
That's a lot of wisdom, again, first using empathy, right? And being able to listen, right? And also not having that need to be right. And would you also, and I'm just curious, like in conversations, you may be able to listen to somebody, even if you're not agreeing, you're still wanting to understand. Is that something that you also practice or something like that?
Absolutely. So I don't necessarily use the terminology agree to
Mhm.
disagree.
Mhm.
However, I can listen to someone without, again, I think it has a lot to do with being condescending,
Mhm.
without saying, well, I'm right, you're wrong. I can listen to their thought process. I can empathize with them, and I can, although I don't take the same position, so to speak, I can still understand why they take that position, because one of the things that I do a lot in hard conversation is I ask a lot of questions because
Mhm.
I want, like, why do you think that way?
Mhm.
So yeah.
Yeah, and that's a good point, talking about like asking questions and, maybe not the frame of agree or disagree, really just listening, knowing, your thoughts on it, but also being open to hear, okay, I wonder what they're thinking about this or what their thought process is.
Yeah.
And so, in terms of questions, just to kind of ask, because maybe the audience is like, asking questions, right? But there are different types of questions. So what kind of questions might you have that keep the conversation open versus closed? Because I think sometimes there could be a closed, conversation where there's like a yes, no answer versus open, right? That the other person might be able to keep speaking. So do you have an example or like a suggestion for us about how to do that?
Well, well, it really depends on what the other person has said. So, like, for example, I had I'm going back to the conversation that I had about racism. And so one of the things that we did not agree on is the stance of police brutality.
Mhm.
And so, because my community experienced it at a higher rate, I am well aware of it, right? I have a son that I've had to talk to about his interactions with the police and stuff like that. And so the woman that I had the conversation with, she did not have that experience. So she came from a place of, well, yeah, I don't think that it's a good idea to not want to have police around because you're promoting lawlessness and blah 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 blah. And so, although I didn't agree with that because that's not what I was actually saying,
Mhm.
I asked her a question. I said, okay, let me ask you a question. I said, what about what I said, kind of caused you to believe that I wanted to do away with the police? And so, like, it led the conversation on. It wasn't a yes or no
Mhm.
answer. I literally led by what she said so
Mhm.
that she can, like, tell me what she was thinking
Mhm.
without just saying yes or no. So, just understanding and listening to the other person is the best advice I could give about asking questions.
Yeah. And that's good. That's a good point. But I like how you said you almost you basically were actively listening, but hearing and saying, what did I say that had you think X, Y, Z? So that could be an example, right? Like where you're taking that phrase. So it's, because again, like if someone hurt, if you're having a speaker, right, that you have the back and forth conversation. And if someone's not really hearing what you're saying, we could get upset, right away. Or we could say, maybe there's like clarity, or maybe there's something that they didn't hear. There's something there that needs to be clarified. So, it's saying, what did I say? Or like, what made you think that? And that's a probably less threatening way to do that. So that's a really great tip, as to how to go about that. And then looking at that, and again, perhaps I know with racism, that's something that continue to be passionate because of experiencing, as an African American woman and even your community. And it's just been ongoing. I mean, this has been in the news and there's so many viewpoints, and it's really just looking at people, right? And really looking at how painful is this and acknowledging that. And so perhaps with that subject, what do you do if you get upset during a conversation? So I know you sort of alluded to that with this this conversation, but when you're upset, like what happens, or like how do you handle that in a hard conversation?
So for me personally, what I know works is to breathe. And I know it like sounds cliche, but like it really does work because you're breathing, you're pausing, you're thinking about what the conversation is. You're thinking about, hey, this person said something that was kind of upsetting to me. And so breathing through it helps you to think, well, why did it upset me? Right? Versus kind of like reacting, and I think a lot of people, that's the reason why they can't have hard conversations, is because they react immediately when someone else is speaking versus allowing their thoughts to, kind of like, well, what was it about that particular thing that made me upset before they even continue on with the conversation? And then you can even tell the person, hey, listen, can you give me a moment? I'm thinking about your last statement.
Yeah.
And then that's usually what works for me.
Mm-hmm. And that's a good, another good tip, pausing, and that is helpful. Now, I do want to say, and again, this is the background of trauma for me. And I know you've talked about having conversations, but for those of you out there, right, like if you are fairly regulated and have gone through a lot of some of the trauma work, and again, there are grief and loss in our life, so we're going to constantly be perhaps working on areas. However, if we've gone through severe trauma, some of you in the audience maybe like, well, it goes from 0 to 10, right? So that means there's dysregulation. And what happens is from trauma is that we're not using our frontal cortex, which are our brain, our main brain. We're using the painful parts because we don't have everything and there's a lot of pain. And so in conversations, and I don't know if you experienced this, Tameka, but sometimes not both people, or maybe both of us are overheated because it's a painful area. And so using the pause works, coming back, that's amazing. But for some of you, and this is even when you're working in the field of education or anything else, cortisol, if we get to a place of anger, right, where someone's angry, it actually takes over an hour, 60 to 90 minutes. This is evidence that to calm down, right? And so in hard conversations, if you're able to be regulated, awesome, right? And then obviously if you're seeing that people are not regulated, it's going to take almost 90 minutes, and that's for both people, right? So depending on, like, and Tameka, I'm sure you've been able to go through hard conversations because of those questions. It may, reduce that possibility. But even so, if the other person is so dysregulated, I'm not sure if you experienced that, I have, it comes to a point where, I may have to end that hard conversation for the moment and come back. And I don't know if you've experienced that. Like, have you ever had to end it because it's just so apparent that, even with those questions, it's just that both, you might be in the space, the other person, or vice versa, where it's like, it needs to come back. And how does that look, or how has that looked for you?
So I think for me, I've been pretty diligent about only engaging in hard conversations with people whom I can continue to engage, whether they're upset or not, right? Simply because I control myself, and I know that's the only person that I can control. So I've already prepared myself for it, right? So I'll say that. However, I've also been in situations where, because the other person was just so deregulated, they just could not keep it together. They couldn't control themselves enough to even continue the conversation without just screaming and just, being very, very upset. And when that did happen, me, in a very calming voice, I actually got lower and I said, I think we need to come back to this at another time, if at all. And that's pretty much all I said.
Mm-hmm. That's good. Have you, from that, I'm just curious, after you've had that, did you end up having conversations, if you've had to say if at all, with some of those people for hard conversations, or some it didn't come
No.
up again?
I will say this, the person that I did have that conversation with, and I had to say, we'll have to come back to this, if at all, we have not had another conversation yet.
Okay.
So.
Yeah, and that happens, right? So audience, there are, again, like, you may want to have those hard conversations. However, it needs two people, right? It needs everybody at the table, or people to be able to calm down and say, okay, I'm ready to have this conversation. Sometimes, depending on the topic, it may need a couple of those things, or acceptance, which is hard, right? But sometimes not, being like, this just isn't happening right now, and when it's supposed to, it will, which seems like you're okay with in that case for, with this person. What do you do? And this might relate, if you go in circles in conversations, like, if there's nothing really happening or any solutions, what do you tend to do in that case of a hard conversation?
So I tend to bring the attention back to that, like the circles that I've noticed. Like I'll say something like, hey, I noticed this conversation continues to go right back to the point that I made earlier in the conversation. And so then I'll say, well, can you explain to me what either you or myself is missing from the point so that we can move forward in the conversation? And I'll just continue to just ask questions like, okay, so, well, what does that mean to you? Well, what did you hear me say? So like, I ask questions so that we can move forward. And nine times out of 10, it is strictly a situation of them not really wanting to accept the answer that I've given them. And so then I'll say, so is it that you want me to say something different? And then they'll kind of like laugh, like seriously, they'll kind of chuckle like, well, no. And so then I'll say, well, it sounds that way to me because we've already covered that. And I've shown you how we've covered it. So I'm just trying to see how we can move forward. And that's usually what happens.
Yeah, no, that's a good practical way, right? To be able to notice that perhaps you talked about it again, and address that way and then continue. So looking at all of these hard conversations, obviously over the years, right, we're always evolving or wanting to change and grow. What were some of the hardest lessons that you've learned? Maybe there's some great ones now, but some that have kept you, like, stuck with you, that you're like, okay, we learn a lot so that we continue to grow and not do that again, right? Or like sometimes we do it again, but we're going to get better. So what are some things that you've learned that have shaped you?
So the first thing that I learned is that I'm not as patient as I had hoped I was. Not as patient at all. That's one of the main things that I would say that I've learned. Another thing I've learned is recognizing the difference in my body of what makes me angry versus what makes me sad. So like someone can say something and it can just like really anger me. And then someone can say something, but it makes me sad. And sometimes I feel like it is kind of intertwined if you're not really paying attention to how it shows up in your body. So that was one of the things that I had to learn too. And then lastly, oh my goodness, this was like the most difficult lessons that I had to learn was how to show empathy to someone who was just very callous and mean because of obvious enviousness.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Well, those are, really big points, anger versus sadness, right? And where does that show up in my body? Because that is important, like, my head, or like, what am I feeling? Am I feeling tense? All that kind of stuff. And that's important to notice, so I think that's really important and critical. And I'm glad that you're, figuring that out. And also that patience thing, right? Like sometimes that pausing or saying, this is an issue that really does cause, from 0 to 10, like I get angry because there's, some stuff, right? Like that, feelings that come up. And so, you recognizing that, and it's important, right? Because we all have that. We have a threshold. Like some things really bring us to a place of sadness or anger, and it's like 0 to 10. And again, like some things in our heart are what we're really, we've experienced, or, that we just have a heart for, and knowing that maybe other people don't, but we do, right? But also knowing that about ourselves, that we're in our conversations. Those are really good, tips and lessons to have learned. So again, hopefully the audience out there, you may be relating and saying, yep, that's me, and I always say I have a lot of patience usually. I mean, I don't know, sometimes if I have people, and I think competition is, again, something where, like, as we keep growing, because I always say that as we keep growing in who we are and loving ourselves and knowing who we are and knowing we have certain strengths and other people have other strengths, and seeing that, it helps, right? Because we need each other. We all have blind spots, we all need growth. We're constantly growing, but knowing that, right, then we don't have less competition, but empowerment comes in. So that's a big one too, like if we're constantly competing, instead of just being like, hey, we both have some stuff that's good, and things that we're working on. So I think those are good points. Are there any books or resources that you want to share with the audience and myself about, how to have hard conversations, or things that you find valuable?
Absolutely. And The first one is kind of like the obvious choice for me. It's the book that I wrote myself called The Confident Leader, because it talks about how to pretty much engage with people and lead yourself as a leader with confidence. There's another really great book called Power versus Force. And I think that it's amazing because it talks about the difference of trying to force something versus just walking in power. And I believe people, if you're going to have a hard conversation, you need to know the difference between trying to force something versus, just being powerful, and eventually that'll influence them. Daring Greatly is another book. I love Brene Brown. Permission to Feel is an amazing book because it talks about, feelings and how to recognize them, things of that nature. And I would say my absolute favorite is The Law of the Garbage Truck. That book is amazing because it talks about how to pretty much lead yourself and lead your thinking. So yeah, those are some books that I would definitely recommend.
Amazing. So again, if you didn't hear all that list, we will be, Tameka, I will be, listing that on the podcast for those of you listening, and those of you tuning in for YouTube, that'll be here. And we certainly, you can certainly reach out. Tameka, do you have like an easy email or anything like that you can shout out here so that they can be in touch with you if they have some more questions or want to know more about your books or what you do?
Absolutely. So the easiest way to reach me is info@parentingconfidentkids.com.
Okay, and we'll also add that. So parentingconfidentkids.com. Woohoo. Okay, look at that. I listened and spoke it again. Okay, so good. So we will have that on there. So finally, and I appreciate your time, Tameka, and again, audience, if you love this, please share this. Please also like, share, subscribe. Again, Tameka's on. You never know, in the future, have her on again. Maybe for hard conversations such as racism, you never know. That is one more takeaway wisdom tip for our audience in the area of hard conversations, perhaps generally, or in race, since that's what we were talking on today.
I would say that if you go into every conversation with the mind frame of wanting to learn something about the other person, it makes it so much easier. You're automatically putting yourself in empathy shoes. You're taking ego out of the equation, because sometimes it is more about what the other person needs from us than even the conversation itself. So how we handle that makes all the difference in the world. And that's one of the main reasons why I cannot stress enough the importance of practicing. And I say practice because sometimes it's not always possible, but practicing self-control, because we are the only persons that we can control. So if we're always controlling ourselves in the conversation, then that makes the difference in the world. And you can have hard conversations about anything.
So that's a lot of wisdom. So again, I love what you said in the beginning too, is, always be willing when you show up in a conversation to learn something from the other person, right? And that's a great thing of what am I going to learn from them, and allowing that conversation to flow that way and being mindful of that. So that's wonderful. So thank you again, Tameka, for being on this YouTube show. I appreciate your wisdom. And again, audience, we love you. We hope that you'll be able to take these practical tips, whether it be pausing, whether it be patience, whether it be knowing yourself and knowing what is your button, right? Or how to walk away from a conversation, or saying, hey, I'm going to learn something today, right? Or I'm going to just listen to another person, even if it's something I completely don't, right? It's not necessarily my value, but I'm going to listen to them to get to know them. So those are really great tips. So again, thank you, Tameka. Thank you, audience. Have a great day and tune in because you want to continue to get your daily dose of wisdom and application. So have a great day, everybody, and be well.